Hello and welcome to Happy You Asked, the podcast where we explore joy one awkward conversation at a time. And I am Erin Claire, your host. With me today is Eranda Jayawickreme. I already said it wrong. I know
That's all
I
right.
did.
No, it's not. It's really close. That's fine.
Say it for me.
It's Jayawickreme.
See, that was much better. I know. I
It's no
have a
problem.
brain block, and especially because he is distinguished. He is the Harold W. Tribble Professor of Psychology and a Senior Research Fellow at the Program for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest University. And his research focused on post-traumatic growth, character, and well-being. Thank you so much for being here, even though I messed up your name.
It's
It's
all
such
right.
an honor.
Thank you so much for having me.
So everybody gets the same first question. What is
Mhm.
your definition of happiness?
Well, I'll give you a very psychological definition of what happiness is, right? So, in my view, and as someone who's done a fair bit of thinking on what happiness is, I think it's best understood as not as a single feeling, not just as this momentary experience of positive affect, but rather as a multidimensional construct. In the psychology literature, we tend to make this broad distinction between hedonic well-being, so your day-to-day momentary experience of positive affect, and eudaimonic well-being, right? Which
Mm.
relates to living a life filled with purpose, meaning, engagement, things that matter to you. I'm pretty certain, previous guests have sort of made the broad.
We've
That's
touched on it.
yeah. So and these constructs are related to each other, right? So people who experience high levels of meaning and purpose, they are more likely to experience high levels of well-being and vice versa, but they are distinct, right? So you can experience moments of purpose and meaning without pleasure, right? And
Mm-hmm.
similarly, you can, experience hedonic highs without those experiences being necessarily meaningful. So I think, it makes sense for us to think about happiness as a broad construct, because I do think a full account of what it means to live a good life requires a consideration of both hedonic and eudaimonic components.
Mm. Hedonic. That word always sounds so dirty, though, right? Every time I think of that, like hedonistic.
Hmm.
Yeah, you got a little bit of that and a little bit of not that for happiness. That's what I always think.
I mean,
You
sorry, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
Now, I was going to say, so I think, I agree with you, right? That, when we think about the hedonic life, right, we think of it as a life that, isn't particularly praiseworthy. But I do think that, I don't know, I think experiencing positive feelings is a key component of a good life, right? And
Hmm.
there are some philosophical accounts, not just, the utilitarians like Bentham, but there are other philosophers who have argued that, you don't want to unnecessary sideline pleasure, right? Pleasure is a key component of living well. We owe it to ourselves to experience pleasure. I think the challenge is when your goals in your life are exclusively focused on pleasure, right? So I think it's really a question of balance.
Mm. Now, we've all heard that, like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Mm-hmm.
And you spend your career testing in some ways whether that's actually true. Is it?
It's a good question. So yeah, as you said, I've spent a lot of my career, probably the last 12, 13 years of my career focused on this question. I actually have a book coming out with Oxford in a couple of months that sort of summarizes all my work on this topic. I do think that under certain circumstances, going through adversity, going through some type of challenge can make people rethink their priorities. It can make
Mm.
them focus on different goals, maybe on their relationships. It can make them appreciate what they have in life. So in principle, right, I do think experiencing some form of adversity can be helpful. There's some research suggesting that moderate levels of lifetime adversity are associated with greater resilience, greater life satisfaction. So this is the work of Mark Seary, who's
Mm.
at SUNY Buffalo, I think. But I think it's important that we be careful about the potential benefits of adversity, because I do think the fact that we find this question so compelling is in part a function of the cultural narrative we have, especially in North
Mhm.
America, around the value of adversity, right? This idea that what doesn't kill you, doesn't kill you, make you stronger. That's in many cases, that's going to be an oversimplification. There's a reason why we find challenging events to be challenging, right? And I think it's also about thinking about distinguishing between different types of events, right? So there's
Mhm.
certain types of trauma and adversity that we wouldn't wish on anyone, right? Even our enemies. So I do think that we need to be careful about sort of implicitly falling back on this claim, because I do think the severity and the type of the adversity, the resources that that person has, psychological and otherwise, the type of social support they have, the cultural context that dictates how you should respond to adversity. So, around 15 years ago, there was a book by Barbara Ehrenreich called Bright-Sided, which was very much about our own reaction after she was diagnosed with breast cancer to this whole idea that you're a warrior fighting against cancer. And she was like, I'm not a warrior. Like, I hate cancer. I would like it to just go away so I can get on with my life. Um,
Mhm.
so I think it's important to acknowledge that adversity can have an impact that's meaningful and potentially beneficial. We don't know what proportion of people have that experience. And I do think because of these cultural beliefs around adversity and the potential value of adversity, we need to be particularly careful about making claims about the benefits of adversity to our friends, to those of us who do therapy, to our clients. And I
Yeah, it
also will,
sounds rude, right?
it, no,
That's really what comes across. It's rude. Like, oh, I'm so glad you get to grow from this horrible experience.
I know.
Like,
I think for many people, it's like, well, I'm already deemed this terrible thing, and now beyond that, I have to start thinking about, okay, how can I benefit from this? How can I grow from this? I think it's a very interesting question. I do think that, going back, to take a step back and thinking about the broader, discussion around replication and open science, that the research on post-traumatic growth does struggle with a number of methodological limitations, and that's, a
Mhm.
large focus of my research. And one reason why I think people have mostly overlooked these limitations is because they find the narrative, this idea that adversity can have benefits, to be comforting, right? So, I just think just thinking about our status as scientists or also human beings, right? We have to be more mindful of the fact that we might give certain scientific ideas, certain hypotheses, a pass, right, when it comes to evaluating the
Mhm.
quality of research, because we already buy into that idea in the first place.
So you've said that the standard way that we measure growth after trauma is fundamentally flawed. So can you
Mhm.
explain what's wrong with that, how we've measured it?
So most studies assessing growth from adversity ask people after the trauma, to what extent have you grown from the experience? And I will say that it's very face valid, right? It's like the way you talk to a
Mhm.
friend or the way you might talk to a therapist. Like a therapist might say, so after this event, do you feel like you become a better person, or do you feel like you become stronger? So I will say, right, that it's a very face valid way, right, of asking this question. The problem is when you ask people how much do you think you've grown, you're asking people to reflect on their past selves and make an evaluation of how much they've changed. And we
Yeah.
don't typically assess change in that way in research, right? When we do research on depression, we don't ask people 5 months into their experience with depression, do you think you become less depressed? What you do is that you assess the levels of depression at one time point, and then you assess them again after a certain period of time, right? So you're asking people to make these retrospective judgments, and we know from multiple studies that when it's not that we're completely useless in making these judgments, but we're not that good, right? So if you look at the correlation between someone's retrospective assessment of change and their observed assessment of the observed change across time, the correlation is from anywhere from 0 to zero point 0.2 to zero point 0.3, right? So it's moderate. So it means that we might have some degree of insight, but you shouldn't be using those assessments as an indicator of growth. Another
Mhm.
issue is that you're asking people how much you think you've changed because of the event. So it's not just how much you've changed over time, but to what extent can you attribute that change causally to the event? And it's pretty clear that we probably don't have that access to that information. It's a bit like, me saying that, when I moved from Philadelphia to North Carolina back in 2010, I became a lot more extroverted. And it might have been because of a number of factors. I moved to the South. The culture is different. I need to make new friends. I'd broken up with my partner at the time, so I had to, create a new community. It's also true that I was in my early 30s when I moved. So it might have been that just because of what we know about personality changing over time, I was going to become more extroverted no matter what happened, whether I stayed in Philadelphia or moved somewhere else. So I think an additional challenge is that you're asking people to make a causal assumption about their change, which they may not always be able to make, right? So I'm not saying that that is impossible. I think one possibility is that maybe as more time passes and as a person experiences more and more outcomes from the event, they might say, oh, yeah, I went through this divorce 10 years ago. I went through this terrible experience. And I see how these changes occur that other people corroborate, right? So I can see how I've changed. So I'm not saying it's impossible. But I think in many cases, we ask people pretty soon after their experience of adversity and trauma how how they've changed as a result of that. And I'm pretty skeptical that people are able to accurately ascribe changes in their personality to the trauma.
So waiting is a much waiting is what you would recommend then, having some distance from that event, or is there other factors that we should think about?
So I do think in the immediate aftermath of going through adversity, we do have a strong motivation to rationalize the experience we've been through, right? So one reason why you might say that we have changed for the better is that, we're trying to make sense of the event. We're trying to gain control over the event. So
Mm.
and you're trying to sort of, if anything, cope with the event. So by saying that you're grown, you're both asserting some control over the event because this bad thing happened, but I responded to it positively. And also, if you can make the claim that something good came out of the event, by the implication is that the event itself is less negative, right? Because the event can't be that bad if you gain something from it. So this is what, in the coping literature, we call this secondary coping or positive reappraisal coping, right? Where you reappraise the adverse event so that it feels less negative so that you can cope, you can like manage it better. I think when people tell you they've grown soon after the experience of the event, that's what they're doing. They're not experiencing growth, they're not becoming better people, they're figuring out a way to manage the impact of that event, right? Another
Mm.
possibility when people tell you they've grown soon after adversity is that they might be engaged in denial, right? It's a bit like when someone goes to a breakup for a while, they'll say, oh, there are plenty more fish in the sea. I'm great. I'm great. And then 3 weeks later, it hits them, right? So I
Mhm.
do think the immediate aftermath of adversity, there are probably a lot of other explanations apart from change that you can sort of use to, explain why people report growth. There's one study that Ted Schwaber, who's in Michigan State, published a couple of years ago, where he found that people who reported the most impactful life event, not necessarily negative or positive, right? But the most impactful life event over the last 10 years. They went, they was part of a longitudinal data set. So they went back to that event and they looked at their change in personality. And they did find that event was, that event to some degree predicted changes in their personality.
Mm.
So I think that's suggestive evidence that if you give people enough time to gain insight, right, they are able to identify events that do end up tracking changes in personality, right? So that's one study that suggested the idea that giving people extra time might enable them to have the type of insight that enables them to identify specific events that have changed them.
What's interesting is it's similar to how we think about history, right?
Hmm.
You can't record a major event and say how it's affect our culture right after it happens. You have to have
Exactly.
time for the history to develop, whether it
Hmm.
seems it's personal or
Yeah.
cultural. It takes some time to understand how it fits in. Yeah,
I think that's
that
exactly
makes
right. I
sense.
think a good example of this, right, is people have been talking about how the last few years in the US, right, seem sort of
Mhm.
so different, right, so uncertain and so sort of trying to find the right word, right? So you see a lot of friction in contemporary society, and I do think that people are saying it's unprecedented, and I would say that you just have to go back to 1968 to the late 60s, right, where 1968 we had Vietnam, we had Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated, we had RFK being assassinated, right?
Yeah.
There were so many things that were going on in that year. You had the riots at the Democratic Convention, and I can imagine, right, that when people look back on the latter half, the last 50 years, they could see this whole period as one era, right? As opposed to it
Mhm.
being like, oh, what happened in the 2020s was totally distinct. So I completely agree with you, right? Sometimes you do need perspective to understand some of the, what are the larger forces at work, right? And I think asking people too soon about the experience of adversity doesn't allow them that reflection, right? Or that space.
100% exactly. You have studied genocide survivors in Rwanda
Mhm.
and war-affected populations in Sri Lanka. What did you learn about growth in those contexts?
So that's a good question. So in Rwanda, what we found, we've done some cross-sectional work. We've also done some interviews, and what we found is that when people talk about benefits, they tend to talk about benefits that are very, I don't use the word like non-psychological, but they're very material. So a good example
Mm.
is they really talk a lot about education, the importance of education, and the importance of their children, of the youth in society getting ahead. And this work we have found, I know there's been work by researchers at the University of Zurich. They have found something similar, that education is seen as really important. When it comes to psychological constructs, they do talk about trust, but they talk about trust going down. Right. So the one explicitly psychological dimension they talk about they talk about it, about depreciations in trust. And when you think about the context, right, where you had this deeply divided society that's now, I mean, it's been like 32 years since the genocide, and
Mhm.
the government that's is still in charge is the government that ended the genocide. Arguably, they're a fairly authoritarian government. They imposes a very clear narrative about about what happened in the wake of the genocide. So it would make sense, right, that people would feel like, there's this fundamental distrust that still exists. I think it'd be interesting to see as time goes by, as younger generations come up, what that means. But we did find, to the extent to which people reported positive changes, is very much on, focused on goods like education, and to the extent to which they spoke about psychological resources or psychological constructs, it was mostly negative. In Sri Lanka, what we find, and I got back from Sri Lanka on Friday after a 3-week trip, and I woke up at 3 in the morning. So right now I feel great. Probably in a couple of hours, I'm gonna start feeling very sleepy. So we're on different schedules. But we toured the country. We spent a lot of time in the north of the country, which was very much impacted by the civil war, which ended in 2009. Um, I do think that you know people really rely on religion a lot. So religious faith is really
Mhm.
important. I will say that on average, people are very religious. So I'm not sure that religion necessarily confers any unique benefit. I think whether you're struggling or
Mhm.
not struggling, or whether you're coping or not coping well, people are still very religious and they rely a lot on their faith. We did a tour of, we went to churches, we went to mosques, we went to Buddhist temples, we went to Hindu kovilas. And I think one thing that would surprise an American, well, not all Americans, but if you're East Coast American, right? If you went to Sri Lanka, what's the level of faith and devoutness people have across all faiths, right?
Mhm.
Clearly the faith means a lot to them and they're very sincere in their faith. Uh, because of this high level of religiosity, I don't know whether it's a predictive factor necessarily. I think people, and this might be one, I mean, again, this is not new. I think there's a lot of research on this, but I think how people think about the good life, how people think about well-being and happiness matters. It's very different. I was
Mhm.
talking to a colleague of mine in Colombo, and one thing he just noted is that, people in the West or people who grow up living between two cultures like me, when we talk about happiness, when we talk about, what it means to live a good life, we want to be known by other people, right? We want to talk about like the challenges
Mhm.
going on in our life. If we want to talk about, if there's a friendship that we find challenging, or if we want to talk about a relationship with someone, we want to try to understand ourselves and understand other people, and we want to understand our friends and our partners. And in Sri Lanka, right, there isn't that same degree of interest in our intra-psychic experience. It's much more
Mhm.
about like, are you going to be there for me? Are you going to shop for me? Are we going to be able to, fulfill some family responsibility? Or are you doing well insofar as that you're living a life of good status, right? So I'm not saying like I'm not saying this in a judgmental way, but I think it's clear that when people talk about their lives or think about how their lives are going well, they think about it in a very different way, right? They think about whether they have status in society. They think about whether
Mhm.
someone's going to be there for them when something comes up, right? And I don't think it necessarily means that, they need to be reflecting more on their lives or we need to be thinking more about our status. But I do think that when we think about how to help people, right, in a post-war context, we shouldn't go in with the assumption that what they need is they need to reflect more on their experiences or they need to
Mhm.
talk out their problems, right? Because I do think people have different ways of um, thinking about what a good life is, and I think we need to be mindful of that when we engage with those communities.
That's fascinating. You've also studied what it means to have good character.
Yeah.
How do you define that as a researcher?
So that's a good question. So I'm a personality psychologist, right? So for me, character is, character traits or character virtues. They're simply like these individual differences in our general tendency to behave in like positive, praiseworthy, moral ways, right? And
Mhm.
I study both moral character, so individual differences in what it means to be honest, what it means to be compassionate, as well as intellectual character. So epistemic traits or intellectual virtues. So what does it mean to be intellectually humble? What does it mean to be open-minded, right? So I've done a fair bit of research on both moral and intellectual traits, and I'm very interested, right, in the dispositional aspect of morality, right? So what is it about the person, our persons? What do we bring to morally relevant situations? The study of characters has a long and somewhat, controversial history in academic psychology. So in the early years of academic psychology, people were interested in the study of character. And then starting in the 1920s, there was this focus on making psychology more of a science, which meant we shouldn't be doing prescriptive work, we should be doing descriptive work. So this is move away from the study of character to the study of personality. And then, I think in part with the advent of positive psychology in like 30 years ago, there's been more of a focus on sort of understanding not only character, not only morality more broadly, but also what does a person bring, right, to morally relevant situations. More recently, I've become very interested in understanding how, what character traits can help us engage with difference, right? How can we be engaged in a tolerant and pluralistic way across meaningful differences, right? So a project that I've just started, both in the United States and in Sri Lanka, is trying to identify what are the personality characteristics, what are the character virtues that enable us, right, to reach out across difference, even when it comes to differences that we feel like are really important, right, where there is some sort of deep moral disagreement.
I think, especially, I love the idea of intellectual humility,
Hmm.
and how key that is to any form of growth. I remember that's one of the things I always just tell my students and my own children. If
Hmm.
someone acts like they know it all, that is the key indicator that they don't know it all, because they're not open to
That's exactly
learning.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the
No, I think
more that you
intellectual
know,
humility
you
is,
realize
sorry.
how little you know.
Exactly. No, I think I mean, it's one reason why I think intellectual humility is clearly so important is no one would learn anything, right, if we didn't have intellectual humility. If there wasn't that awareness that we could be wrong or that we don't know everything there is to know, at some point you'll just become a know-it-all and you just say, well, I know everything, right? You know, I'm completely uninterested in your opinion, right? So I do think it's a really important characteristic, and I think one that's important to model, right? Not only to, I think one way in which we can promote it among youth, among our children, among students, is to model it.
100%. Absolutely. And in leadership too, any of those things, that is a model of a good leader, because at least from what I've always seen, if they're not intellectually have some humility, then
Hmm.
there's no way that they can know what's going on with the people around them, the people who report that they serve. That's so critical and so key.
Oh yeah, I think
What
that's exactly right. And I also think that it's also a way to create a strong bond, right, as a leader. Because if you tell your what I call people on your team that, look, I don't have all the answers, you might have some of the answers, right? In a sense, you're empowering them, right? You're making them feel like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, I can actually contribute, even though I'm part of this structure, part of this hierarchy. The leader, my leader, is actually open, right, to new ideas, to being corrected. I think that can only be good for the team.
Exactly, and that's how a team should work, right?
Exactly.
The leader can't know everything and can't do all the parts, and that's why you hire people who are better at it than you are, this aspect and that aspect, and that
That's
forms a
exactly right.
team rather than a horrible situation.
Hmm. I think that's right.
Yeah. So if someone's listening, has gone through something terrible and is being like told they should find the silver lining by their grandma or their aunt or something, what would you say to that person to help?
So first of all, what I would say is, I think the reflex to say that, oh, you need to find a silver lining, right? In a sense, you're saying that because you're sort of the belief there, right, is that you want to like we should just be happy all the time, or feeling down or feeling upset or feeling like unhappy in the wake of the event is not something normal, right? So I think the first thing I would do is normalize the fact that, sometimes it's, part of living life is to be disappointed, is to struggle, is to feel down, right? And that's not to say that, oh, you should embrace it, it's great, but just acknowledge the fact that everyone feels this way at some point, right? Like this is, everyone when people everyone struggles at some point, and it's normal, right? But if you tell someone to look for the silver lining, in a sense, you're telling them to feel bad for not having grown from it, right? So the first thing I would do is I would say, look, it sucks that you're struggling. This is something that people go through. And I would start by normalizing it. The second thing is that I would probably refrain from trying, like by looking at the silver lining, by asking someone to look at the silver lining too quickly, you're sort of asking them to solve the problem, right? And I would probably not focus in the moment on directly engaging the problem. I would probably have them focus on other aspects that could improve their lives. So, social connections with people that they trust, engage in activities that they find meaningful. For some people, physical activity, right, gets them out of their head. basic things like sleep, right? These are all like,
Mhm.
these are not sort of, civil, like, they're not like flashy interventions, but we all know those types of activities are really important for our well-being. And I think, especially when you're recovering from something negative, that I would say those can have the most helpful immediate impact, right?
Yeah.
Um, and then I would probably over time have them reflect, right? And maybe on their own time, right? When they feel ready to it, they can reflect on why they're unhappy, right? Does it have to do with the nature of a particular relationship? Does it have to do with a certain goal or a certain value that they have? And if so, should they be reflecting on whether they should keep holding that goal or value? Um, and and then, right, I guess that if people are continuing to struggle, right, this is where I think talking to someone, right, talking to a professional
Mhm. would
would be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's great advice. And certainly when things are hard, there's sort of little things we know that will help get us through. Sleeping well,
Hmm.
go get out for a walk, right? Get through your moment by moment. And then we
Hmm.
can reflect on bigger things.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think especially talking to people, engaging with people that you trust, I think that's particularly important because when we go through hard things, our first impulse is usually to retreat. And I think in general, we make a mistake when we do that.
I agree. And I do that too. Guilty as charged.
Hmm.
Guilty as charged. Now, what about for yourself? How did you come to study happiness? What led you in your life led to doing this?
That's a good question. I mean, so I grew up in Sri Lanka, right? So my parents are Sri Lankan. They were actually I was born in London. They met in the UK. My father moved there in the 60s. My mother moved there in the early 1970s to be a nurse in the NHS. And they moved back in the early 1980s. They moved back off when I was just a few years old because they wanted to raise us in Sri Lanka. But then I moved to the US 25 years ago, right? So I'm sort of like, in some ways, right, I inhabit multiple cultures just as a result of my childhood. It is also true that I grew up, in Sri Lanka in the 1980s and the 1990s, and it was a very violent time, right? There was a
Yeah.
long-running civil war that lasted all through my childhood. There was an insurrection where a Marxist group tried to overthrow the government in the late 1980s, and so I grew up with a lot of violence, right? And because I was young, I just assumed, oh, this is why it is to grow up, right? Like we can't go to school because people are getting killed out in the streets. And it took me coming to the US in 2001 to realize, oh, that's not normal, right? That was a very strange and terrible experience for many people, right? And I think I was always interested in the idea of how people manage despite these challenges, right? How do people function despite these challenges? How do they find a way to live meaningful lives? And I think, I have an identical twin brother who's also a psychology professor, and he got
Oh,
interested in
how
clinical.
fun.
I know, so much for nature nurture, but he got interested in trauma, right? He studies trauma, and I got interested in well-being. So there's a bit of a yin yang thing going on, right? Where
Yeah.
I was interested in this question of how do people live good lives despite all these challenges, right? And he was interested in how are people's lives impacted by these challenges. So I think, when I was in college, I took a first year seminar with a psychology professor on hope. And I think it was that class that got me really interested in the psychology of well-being. I then after I did my study abroad semester in my junior year, I came back and took a philosophy class on character. And I think those two
Oh,
classes combined really sort of set the foundation for my interest in happiness. And then I was fortunate to go and do my graduate work at Penn, do a lot of work on happiness and well-being and resilience. And then once I moved to Wake Forest back in 15 years ago, I started doing more systematic work on post-traumatic growth.
because as you were talking about trauma, I was like, to me, that hope is always that key piece
Yeah,
that
yeah.
keeps people going. If they have that tiny bit of hope, then
Hmm.
that's what will move them day to day, so then they can process and grow and figure out how that trauma factored in. But if there's no hope,
Hmm.
that's 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 key, it seems to me. Is that yeah, that's what I
Yeah, no,
found.
I think that's exactly right. And there's a large psychology literature on hope. There's some recent philosophical work. So my colleague Michael Lamb
Mhm.
has a book called A Commonwealth of Hope. He's an Augustine scholar, and he talks about the importance of hope for us, sort of find a way to be the best people we can moment to moment, right? There's
Mhm.
a philosopher, I think she's at Edinburgh, Mara van der Lut, who's written a book called Hopeful Pessimism about how
Oh,
even in the wake of all the the environmental challenges, the various challenges we face in the contemporary world, why it's important to have hope, right? Why it's important to have this belief that we can engage with the world to make a difference, right? So I do think that I think hope is such an important virtue, such an important characteristic, because ultimately, right, the world can only become better if we believe we have the agency to make it better.
100%. Now, a lot of people, I'll ask them like moments when they felt truly happy. And this
Mhm.
idea of well-being despite all of this stuff. Can you talk about a moment from your childhood, even though it was war-torn, that felt truly happy?
Well, so my brother and I were lucky. We grew up in a fairly comfortable middle class household, right? So, and we were young, right? I think if we were, so we were 9, 10 years old during the insurrection. If we were 18, 19 years old, we would have been like probably, among the group of people that would have been at risk, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I have, positive memories of like, one thing we did when we couldn't go to school was that we learned how to bake. We learned how to cook, right? We would get my mother's cookbooks and we would, I remember learning how to bake bread. My brother became really good at making desserts. And, you know, we were young, right? We didn't know what's going on. So it feels very idyllic, right? Now, looking back, it is profoundly strange. But I remember like really getting into sort of various hobbies when we were young. And it's interesting. So I just got back from Sri Lanka right on Friday, and spending 3 weeks. I was there with a group of Wake Forest students. We were doing a short-term study abroad program. But it's interesting, right? When you go back and you know Sri Lanka is, in a way, part of my present life because I go there every year, but it's also a big part of my past, right? And it's
Yeah.
interesting to sort of reflect on experiences that I had when I was young. And, there's meaning that comes from that, right? There's a sense of, oh, I'm glad that I can still have that connection with my past, right? Which, if I wasn't able to go back on a regular basis, I wouldn't have, right? So I do
Hmm.
think that, part of what it means to have a happy life, a meaningful life, is to have a life that you feel has some sort of coherent narrative structure, right? Where you
Hmm.
can make sense of your life in light of your experiences. And I'm grateful for the fact, right, that my childhood isn't just in my childhood, right? Like it's not my
Yes.
experience of Sri Lanka is not just my memories, right? But there's also
Yeah.
this ongoing different relationship I have, right, now. Which is also
Yeah.
complicated by the fact that I'm married in America and I have kids, I have 2 children, right? And they're gonna have a different identity from me, right? And I think part of the acceptance I need to have is, there are gonna be aspects of that childhood that I'm not gonna be able to understand, right? And there are gonna be aspects of my childhood I share with them that they won't be able to understand. But that's just what it is, right?
That's
That's just
normal.
yeah,
I mean, and
exactly.
even in a smaller way, I went to visit my mom in Painesville, Ohio yesterday, a little town
Yeah,
where I grew up. And even going back there, like Thomas Swift says, you can't go home again in the sense it's a different town. But
exactly.
I
Yeah.
can trace a story that then in my head is mine, right? It
Hmm.
both involves that town and it's outside of it as it's grown since I've been away. And it's really fascinating, be it an entire different culture or
Hmm.
even just within the state, someplace that changes and shifts and is yours, but also not yours anymore. It's
Exactly.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, and this has been wonderful. I have two questions left for you.
Hmm.
One, my favorite. You get to add one song to the Happy US playlist, whatever song you would like. No rules, just one
Okay.
song you like. So what song would you like to add to it?
So I didn't think about this. I would add a song by the Scottish band Franz Ferdinand called "Right
Oh, I love
Action."
Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah, yeah. So
Which
"Right
song?
Action," which is it's called "Right Action."
Great Action. I don't know that one. I'm excited, but I love Franz Ferdinand. That's a great group.
I mean, it in a sense is about character, right?
Mhm.
But it's also a fun song. It's a fun, happy song.
I love that
Yeah,
idea. I love actually this. I'm like, I love all the fascinating research, but what song is it? Because that's what I'm waiting for at the end. Because it says so much about
hmm,
people, not just as researchers and thinkers, but what they value. And
exactly.
yeah, and that's like another research project we could do out there. What's your favorite song? We'll
Hmm.
get together. We'll figure that out.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you have any final advice you'd like to give our listeners about happiness?
That's a good question. So I think, as I mentioned right at the beginning of our conversation, right, I think happiness is a multidimensional construct. It's not simply feeling good. In some ways, I think we want to resist the idea of oversimplifying what we mean by happiness. I think one thing that we do, especially in the US, is that we over focus on happiness, right? I don't think happiness
Hmm.
should be the goal. Happiness should be a side product of the meaningful actions and activities we engage in. Many people have said this. I think when we think about what makes for a happy life, I think part of it is what we bring to a given situation, right? The hope or the agency or the attitude we bring, right? It's also the economic, social, cultural structures, right, that enable or inhibit societal flourishing, right? Thinking about that interplay, right? It's not just the individual, it's not just the context, it's both, right? And I think going
Mm.
forward, when we try to improve our societies, right, thinking about both will be important, right? It's not, you can't just have one or the other, right? And I also think, just coming off my own research on post-traumatic growth, studying the predictors of happiness, the predictors of well-being as rigorously as we can, right? Even if the
Mhm.
takeaways aren't in line with our pre-existing beliefs, right? I mean, I'm not saying that people do this in bad faith. I just think it's really hard to do research when the results don't necessarily line up with our values because our immediate reaction is to undercut the findings. Oh, clearly there's something wrong with the study or something wrong with the design, right? Whereas sometimes, if the science is, I'm not saying that one study can solve problems, but we need to be open to being proved wrong, right? We need to have intellectual humility. So I guess those are my final thoughts.
I love both of them. What is the name of your new book coming out?
Um, that's a good question. You asked, for some reason I don't remember. It's called Is There Always Value to Adversity? Looking Beyond What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Stronger. And it's coming out with Oxford University Press. I think it's going to come out beginning of August.
Wonderful. I love it. She's like, you're just like me. I'm like, I don't remember the name of my book. Give me a sec.
Give me,
Yeah,
I know exactly.
that's perfect. It has been an absolute joy. I love the work you're doing. I love
You may kind of
how
say
it,
that.
yeah, it makes it so much more complicated, which is good because
Mhm.
that's what it is. That's how our life is and our emotions. So thank you for this work. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and thank you to everybody for listening. To Happy You Asked, and until next time. Bye bye.